Hey, good morning, YouTubers. So, morning conversation. What is it, Friday? This one might get long because it's pretty convoluted, but this is about building a contract. If you've never built a contract for a job, you have labor and you have materials, very basically. Management and overhead and insurance and everything else, but labor rates aren't supposed to include all of that for an individual. So the final arbiter of labor rates on federal contracts is the Department of Labor's rate table. It's what you use to set up the pricing for federal contracts for resources. So this is called FTE labor, full-time equivalents. So when I go and design a project, I need 4 engineers, I need 8 electricians, I need 6 millwrights, I need a safety officer part-time. So all of these things are an FTE role on a big level when you go to build a contract and bid. So I've got a total of 40 different resources that I need full-time for 2 years. And then I've got another 60 resources I need part-time across those 2 years. So I build a big schedule up and labor rates for those occurrences and materials, depending on what part of the contract I'm working on, right? So now you've got a huge table of resources needed by month, scheduled out over a year or 2 project time. You've got millions of dollars worth of parts. You might have subcontractors with subcontract responsibilities in there that those other people and engineers are watching over. So it just got pretty big. Your materials you hand off to a purchasing department and hope that all their standards meet what you were talking about and maybe you assumed. So purchasing rules might even count depending upon what you're buying, and you have to know all the specs went out right. If I'm buying specialty instruments for gases, all the O-rings inside that instrument have to meet a set of specifications, and that can change the price because it's a special order. So all of these things are part of huge contract building. So what happens is, for federal contracts, you go back in and you say, okay, here is the federal labor rate. This is what the federal government has decided they will pay. It's tables designed by region, so it allows for cost of living between the East Coast and the Midwest and the North. So somewhere is a huge spreadsheet with a column that basically says the job, or FTE, and an hourly rate for it. And it is for every federal government contract position. Everything you build in that contract will use one of those resource types if you're going to be billing the government for it. With that resource type comes a list of qualifications that's necessary for the company to have found in the employees, and not that they necessarily check hard. So now you've got a big 2-year budget, 40 people. If you have 40 people and each one earns $40,000 a year for an average for all of those people, you've got $16 million in salaries alone. So do the math yourself, correct me. But so over 2 years you've got $16 million. How do you make money off of this stuff? Well, those federal labor rate tables are not the prevailing wage tables that the states might use, that a company might use. So if I bid 10 senior software developers of my 40-person staff that I'm allocating, then I'm going to be billing hundreds of dollars an hour for those resources. I'm probably going to be paying them $30, $40, $50 an hour, but I'm going to be billing $100 an hour. One of my billing rates was too much money, way too much money. I got approximately maybe 20%, 25% of that billing rate. So the rest of it went to overhead somewhere, which is some pretty, we're talking a 60% overhead in management. So that is other resources I use. So I use a lot of leveraged resources because I make calls to people. I use people's times confirming these things in emails and conversations and meetings over days, weeks, and years. So another department could actually bill me for some person's time against my project. It would go against my full-time equivalent. I don't have people on my contracts. I have jobs. If the person can't do the job, then my contract's going to fail. So this is some of the this is some of the business you go through. So if I'm going to bid a federal project, let's say a government wants to outsource their federal resources. Now, their federal resources are actually pay tied to these labor rate tables because the unions know the values of these jobs. This is why Republicans hate these unions, because they're generally a little bit intelligent about their professions, their professionals, and the career people that are involved with doing things right. So lots of dynamics in contract management, getting things done. But this cost of this labor, if I can come in and I can FTE bid on a job, and I can say, oh, I'll take all these folks that are still here because I can absorb them into my labor rate table. I can, even though they're high paid and I'm going to be low margin on those few, I can make up that margin on another 30 people in my contract. And this is leveraging. This is some of the soft things in the back room. So I commit 4 hard resources, senior resources, and to them I might give 5 or 6 junior resources, or more or less, depending on what the workload is, for them to get the work done within the requirements of whatever we need. Remember, we're talking with maybe hundreds of people. We've got requirements gatherers. We've got all types of people out there with, safety, health and safety, environmental, engineering, boilers, electrical, steam, plumbing, wire. So lots of different types of trades can be involved in these things, or professionals. So I was a senior chemical engineer being billed to the Department of Energy at a senior chemical engineer rate. That is a tough job. It was good money, very good money, but it also made me realize how easy it is to make money off of these government contracts. That's the basis of them. When you have 1,000 resource contract committed to somebody, it becomes fairly easy. Well, you have to move these experts around, these resources around. You fly somebody and they live somewhere for 6 months or a year. So now you've got living expenses and stuff on top of that. And the living expenses is dependent upon what part of the state you live in. These are little changes in the billing, in the contracts, and how much you can charge. But along with my billing rate was a housing allowance. So I also had a very nice, might have been called a stipend at the time, because this was years ago. And being in senior privileged management, you have some, let's say the paychecks are good. The paychecks are good. The work is hard. The work is this stuff and phone calls and conversations. So this huge 40 resource contract, tens of millions of dollars in salaries and payrolls and insurance for those people, and management and support resources and computers and IT and software licenses and software access and security access. So I've got, half an FTE a month just as a security team. Somebody else is providing the work. I'm getting billed for it, and internally somewhere, but the government's also paying for that full-time equivalent. This isn't a person. This isn't me. I am an FTE role inside a big contract. So I can come into a federal contract and look at federal labor rates and know that most of the people there, know their labor mix, that the bulk are probably mid and senior people. They're well paid, and whatever I can do to get rid of those people over earlier in the contract and later, I can replace them with juniors, and I can lower pays and increase my margins. And the government will never be the wiser to it, because they can't see our profits, because it's buried inside of corporate books. And we'll give ourselves huge bonuses at the end of all of this for all the little people we screwed in between. All the subcontractors that might have to go to court to get paid for what they did. This is the land of contracts and Trumpisms and things like that. I no-bid a multi-million-dollar contract and pissed my peers off because I couldn't find an environmental lawyer capable of working with me to figure out what our corporate obligations would be. Few people understood why that was important. That was the most disconcerting part, that they wanted me to put in a multi-year, multi-million-dollar bid package on something that few people within this Fortune 50 IT company had a whole lot of awareness about, or this, even though this was millions of dollars, it wasn't big enough. They knew better than to get involved because of the liabilities there. So again, that was calls to an office, please return my calls. I'm with another division saying blah blah, escalate through my management, no responses. So because the management didn't understand the gravity of the contract, the liabilities in the contract, the insurance we would have had or the bonds we would have had, because this is state and federal environmental pollution monitoring. So, and it was a tiny contract in the scheme of the things. Most of that was subbing out to instrument houses for design, build, and maintenance. So, because those instruments can be expensive. So these are big contracts. This is just one at 11 minutes now. This is how multi-billion-dollar contracts are billed that last tens of years. If I'm going to build a nuclear reactor, I have to have a fuel supply for it. I have to know somebody's looking out for the fuel supply for my nuclear reactor. Guess who that is? Department of Energy and Department of Defense, because nuclear is not a separate, it never was a separate thing from weapons. This is the life of big contracts. This is the life of, I had a large multi-million-dollar program plan put together that was in concert with a facilities renovation. So there's two budgets that you consider in there. The facilities budget, which is basically capital investment, and then the operations budget. And at some point, everything shifts to operations, and will they be ready for it? Operations and maintenance. So you do these multi-year considerations. Fortunately, in a union environment, your labor stability and skill sets are pretty well defined. It's fairly easy not easy, you have to know the ropes, but it's not too hard to put together a contract like that. And this is what happens. This is the world of big multinational global corporations transmitting data across the planet. While America was building the public internet, corporations were building private internets. We put fiber optic cables down the side of rail lines for intercorporate communications, separate from what you would consider the internet. Satellite communications around the globe. This is global communications, global conversations, global corporations, and how the real world works while denying the real world. So therein is the crux of it. So these billing things are huge, important parts here. These contracts, the contract descriptions and definitions are huge, important parts here. When you're speaking about nuclear physics, nuclear chemistry, weapons research, you get into secret and top secret clearances. When you speak to radar systems at some levels, when you speak to instrument measurements and parts per billions and trillions, you're into the land of secrets, corporate secrets, recipes for bombs and for good, and plastic and ceramics, and what makes the world spin around. So another too long talk. I'm at 15 minutes now. So what I did search for was, one of the few things I searched for, federal labor rate table. That's kind of what started this conversation. It's something I've been worked with and around for decades, knowing that table was there. But typically I would go to, state and local contract labor rates. Electricians and technical skills. Mostly electricians' work is what I would have bid around. Running wires and pipes, maintenance items or upgrade items on existing equipment. So you're doing major upgrades during a shutdown. You might pull half a plant out and put half new in, but the old stuff is still there, and you upgraded a lot of that, which is capital investment versus operations, which is another budget consideration. So there's Program Management 501. It is financial resources. You use tools like SAP and SAS and IBM. There's 3 to 5 to 7 super large corporate database structure tools that put all of this information together. SAP is the one that's come to mind because I was an expert in that for some time. But that ties all of this computer database stuff, all those labor rate tables, project and program plans, program documentation. This is called project management. This is executive and senior level corporate boardroom actions and conversations around how a project's going in 4 pages or in 1 page, and 4 squares on that 1 page. You had to be able to clearly inform an executive group in a 15 or 20 minute presentation talking about millions of dollars, hundreds of people, product timelines, costs, expenses, risks, and issues. So you come up with neat little charts and parts of PowerPoints, and then extended information sets and metadata and client data and all the information that goes into the information that we've already got and gets added onto. So this is very quickly by program management, resource management, resource planning. I didn't get much into financials, although the chemical plant we were in, every piece of equipment there was a specialty item. So even ordering anything with flanges or seals required specific high temperature, caustic, or base acid resistant type of materials, or else they would deteriorate. And even if you did find them, they would deteriorate. So you had a 5-year life on a valve flange, and you already planned in 5 years to replace that valve, and you've got a general idea of maintenance costs and requirements for a plant and a system that's going to last 30 to 50 to 100 years. Your amortized, your write-off is a 30-year schedule, but you did something at 15 years, so depending on how you scheduled it, you've got more write-off for the cost of the structure. In IT, the cost of the structure is far less than the cost of the intelligence inside the structure. So different rules building an IT-centric bid and the resources for that versus building an automation line to produce 200 parts a minute with 3 operators and 5 global suppliers delivering parts just in time to make the widgets to deliver tomorrow. So if anyone thinks it was that easy, if anyone thinks it was the favorite game show or a Donald Trump show, a reality show, then they're probably masters in business administration. So thank you for listening. Appreciate it. Most of these videos get, I think the average is about 4 minutes of viewing, and not a huge audience. That's not why I'm here. Peace out. Love. Think about it. What is this? Mindfulness. Ooh, mindfulness and Zen yogas, oohies, check the stars, and happy National Donut Day. Probably one of the most important days compared to whatever yesterday was, and that IQ piece of crap orange thing we've got says, where's reality again?